History as it happens, March 11, 2021, ending the forever war.
The plane has crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center.
It's exploding right now. You got people running up the street.
Another passenger plane hitting the World Trade Center.
In an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
20 years after that day of infamy, the United States has yet to extract its last armies from Afghanistan. The war on terror became a forever war. But now a May deadline looms to get the American forces out once and for all. Will it finally really happen? That's next as we report History as it Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
And as Commander-in-Chief, I have determined that it is in our vital national interest to send an additional 30,000 U.S. troops to Afghanistan.
The consequences of a rapid exit are both predictable and unacceptable.
Hey everybody, welcome back. Has it really been 20 years since George W. Bush led our country into Afghanistan? Names such as Bin Laden, al-Qaeda, Taliban, so familiar now. They were names Americans had given little, if any, thought. In a short podcast, we can't possibly retrace every step and analyze every move made over the past 20 years. The war outlasted 3 presidential administrations, with Biden's now the 4th. Will he be able to end it? Even if we were able to recapitulate every major development since October 2001, it would probably sound repetitive pretty quickly. Because with each new military commander, with each new president, we get statements such as this one.
We are committed to a responsible and sustainable end to this war, while preventing Afghanistan from becoming a safe haven for terrorist groups and that threaten the interest of the United States and our allies, and ensuring a just and durable end to the long-running conflict.
That's President Biden's Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, but it could have been any major U.S. official over the past 2 decades. When was the last time you actually had a conversation about the war in Afghanistan or read a newspaper article about it? Do you know how many Americans have died in the war? More than 3,500. More than 100,000 Afghan civilians have been killed or wounded since 2001. Civilian casualties have exceeded 10,000 in each of the past several years. Again, that's dead and wounded. Afghanistan's been in a state of war since 1979. The Soviet invasion provoked resistance by many Afghan factions as well as foreign jihadists. They traveled to Afghanistan to battle the communists. Osama bin Laden was one of them, and many of those fighters were provided arms, money, and legitimacy by the United States under Carter, then Reagan. After the Soviet withdrawal, a civil war raged for years until the Taliban prevailed in the mid-1990s. But Afghanistan wasn't brought peace. And after September 11, 2001, a new era of warfare began when the U.S. backed anti-Taliban forces to topple the government, such as it was. And here we are today, still waiting for peace and stability, still fighting with and negotiating with the Taliban. We have 2 conversations for you today. We're going to speak with Adam Weinstein, a U.S. Marine veteran who's now a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft.
There isn't an acceptance in Washington that we've lost the war. And I think the reason that there isn't an acceptance is because it's a different kind of war.
But first, we're going to check in with Guy Taylor, the Washington Times national security team leader, starting with the fact that a peace agreement was reached last year, but the current Afghan government did not participate in the negotiations. Only the U.S. and Taliban were at the table. Here's Guy Taylor on what's in that deal.
American troops agreed to leave Afghanistan on the condition that the Taliban begin negotiations with the U.S.-backed government in Kabul, release a bunch of prisoners to the U.S.-backed government in Kabul, and end safe haven for al-Qaeda and Islamic State and other extremist groups, as well as engage in a dramatic reduction of violence, stop attacking U.S.-backed Afghan military forces, stop attacking U.S. and other international NATO and allied coalition forces. the Taliban engaged in the prisoner swaps, but the talks between the Taliban and the US-backed government in Kabul, the Afghan government, have essentially gone nowhere. And yet the United States has been drawing down its troops. So we're in a bit of a tricky spot right now, as violence also has continued in Afghanistan over the last year.
So, Guy, it sounds like some of the conditions of the peace deal are not being met any longer. What options are the Biden team looking at?
The Biden team has a really sticky political situation here. It could either continue to pull U.S. forces out, even though the Taliban is not really living up to its end of the bargain and violence is continuing. Taliban and other militants are surrounding Afghan cities at the moment, pretty much waiting for the Americans to leave. The risk of a Taliban seizure of Kabul, for instance, is real. So Biden could do a surge of U.S. troops. This would hold the Taliban back and show them that the United States was serious about making sure that the country isn't swallowed again by Taliban rule as soon as the Americans leave. At the same time, Biden could pull out U.S. troops and say, it's time. It's been 20 years and we're done with this. This is a forever war and a quagmire. Or Biden could more or less do nothing besides push for more negotiations and say, we've got it down to about 2,500 U.S. troops and we're not going to pull out now. We're going to see if there's a status quo that holds and hope that negotiations between the Taliban and the U.S.-backed government actually start. And remember, sometimes these things take a very long time. If you look at, say, Colombia and the negotiations between the U.S.-backed government in Bogota and the FARC Marxist rebels, those negotiations took decades. So, holding the status quo now might be a viable option. I don't think that Joe Biden wants to see a U.S. pullout in a Vietnam-style situation where American helicopters are plucking people off of rooftops as the country gets swallowed by Islamic extremist violence, while the U.S. lost a war there that took 20 years, trillions of dollars, and American lives.
So it sounds like you're saying the Biden administration sees the presence of a mere 2,500 troops, with, of course, air support, as holding the line against the Taliban taking control of the country again.
Yes, just in the way that you're putting it, I think that's exactly how the Biden administration is reading it. But I think you also have to consider this allied geopolitical consideration, which is that there are actually more European and others. I mean, there are troops from all over the world that are holding down the international coalition, which is about 10,000 troops. There are only 2,500 Americans still in country, but there are about 10,000 other troops. The Germans, the Italians are there. And if the Americans pull out, what message does that send NATO, especially at a moment when Biden is trying to tell the world that he's going to recover America from this really standoffish, aggressive, hyper rhetorical posture that the Trump administration engaged in towards NATO.
Biden was a skeptic about the troop surge under Obama, correct?
Sure. I think that Biden is wary of forever wars, the same way that Trump was. That's not just some populist messaging. And I think he was also wary of nation building. What is the actual vital interest for the United States grand strategy in Afghanistan? Is it to build a country? Is the United States going around the world building countries now? Or was it more an actual security imperative where we were there to defeat al-Qaeda because it used Afghanistan as a base to plan the horrific suicide hijackings that targeted buildings in New York and Washington 20 years ago? So I think he was worried about mission creep, this idea that the surge would lead to more and more troops. I think at the high point in around 2011, there were about 100,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan. There are some people that will argue, by the way, just to be fair here, that was never enough troops, that in fact, the number should have gone to 200,000 in order to really control the country and crush the Taliban.
But to what end?
Well, it's a really good question, Martin, and it gets at this debate in American foreign policy over how committed the United States is to international intervention in the post 9/11 era and in the post Cold War era. And what we've seen is this reluctance on the part of American leadership to engage in these things, with the exception of the years immediately after 9/11. So one thing that I think is very much worth considering is not just defeating the Taliban, but what the impact on the entire region would be by a dramatic U.S. force, ongoing, permanent presence in Afghanistan. Afghanistan borders Iran. It borders all of these former Soviet republics. It's very close to India. It borders India. It's very close to China. A permanent U.S. troop presence would send a message to these countries that the United States is not giving up and not leaving. That is one argument that can be made. I'm trying to lay out for you as objectively as possible,
Sure,
the deeper thinking behind what's going on here, that if the United States cuts out now, what was the point of any of this?
Well, that's a question that's echoed through 2 decades. Guy Taylor, Washington Times National Security Team Leader, thank you. All right, let's dive right into our next conversation. Adam Weinstein was deployed to Afghanistan as a U.S. Marine in 2012, and he's traveled across Pakistan for his research into the conflict. Now he's a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a D.C. think tank. Adam Weinstein, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So the mission statement of the Quincy Institute is, the foreign policy of the United States has become detached from any defensible conception of U.S. interests and from a decent respect for the rights and dignity of humankind. So is it safe to say that your position is the U.S. needs to get out of Afghanistan?
Yeah, I do think the U.S. needs to get out of Afghanistan after 20 years.
Can you go over some of the reasons for those who may not be aware of your position on this?
Well, it comes down to the fact that we don't have a clear objective in Afghanistan. And even if you take for granted all the ever-changing objectives that are used as a justification for remaining in Afghanistan, we don't have the ability to shape those outcomes. So, for example, people will say, well, we need to stay in Afghanistan until the Afghan security forces are able to stand on their own. But they've become so dependent on the United States, the support of the United States military, that those two goals are in conflict with one another. Although I'm not an advocate of cutting funding for the Afghan security forces, I am an advocate of leaving Afghanistan militarily and having them transition to take a monopoly on the use of force there. Now, granted, the security forces are doing the majority of the fighting, but they're still heavily reliant on U.S. Special Forces, U.S. air support. And when there are major Taliban offensives against provincial capitals, the U.S. military has to step in. And that's the definition of forever war. That's why remaining in Afghanistan, even in a small capacity, ties us to a counterinsurgency that's never ending. Other reasons that folks will give for staying in Afghanistan is nation building type objectives, whether it has to do with individual rights or education. And I think the United States can support those through U.S. aid or through diplomacy, but I don't think that the U.S. military should be used essentially as human shields or sitting ducks to ensure that provincial capitals in Afghanistan are not taken by the Taliban. I think the U.S. has to accept the fact that it has limited control over outcomes on the ground and use the tools the non-military tools that it does have.
If we haven't been able to accomplish our goals, whatever they may be, after 20 years, then when, right?
Yeah, well, that's a very good point. And whenever there's a new proposal for Afghanistan, it's like they take an Etch-a-Sketch and shake it, and they act as if we're starting with a clean slate. And we're not. It's always as if, well, we were doing it wrong before, but now that we do it this way, things will change. But you have to place it within the context of the last 20 years. And the U.S. has tried a lot of different policies. They had a surge of something like 100,000 U.S. troops on the ground. And in fact, I deployed to Afghanistan at the tail end of that surge. They've tried to win the direct military firefight, and that didn't work. Now, I do think we are at an inflection point in that for the first time, you have the Taliban and the Afghan government at least sitting at the same negotiating table. But there's a big difference between sitting at a negotiating table and coming out with a political settlement. And if you look at other conflicts around the world, especially where the insurgency is still quite strong, the likelihood of a political settlement resulting from these negotiations is quite small. So while I think the U.S. should support this dialogue between different Afghan stakeholders, the idea of holding U.S. troops hostage to the outcome, to me, is insanity.
What do you mean by holding troops hostage?
That's essentially what an open-ended military commitment is. If you look at the recommendations of the Afghanistan Study Group report, they had senior advisors who disagreed with those findings. But if you look at what the leadership came up with from the Afghanistan study group, they came up with this idea that we should have a conditions-based withdrawal. And on paper, that sounds good. We shouldn't leave Afghanistan until the Taliban does precisely what we want them to do so far as counterterrorism guarantees, women's rights, civil liberties, a political settlement, a reduction in violence, and so forth. But that acts as if the reason we've gotten to this point is because we've militarily defeated the Taliban, and we haven't. There isn't an acceptance in Washington that we've lost the war. And I think the reason that there isn't an acceptance is because it's a different kind of war. In a counterinsurgency, for the insurgents to win, all they really have to do is keep fighting and maintain enough of a presence on the battlefield that they're a formidable opponent. But for the counterinsurgency to win, you essentially have to extinguish the insurgency. And that just hasn't happened in Afghanistan. And the other complication that comes with a counterinsurgency is that it gets wrapped up with nation building and trying to build institutions inside Afghanistan. And the US has failed at all of those objectives. So while it might not feel like a military defeat in the traditional sense of, conventional war, it is a defeat. That's why we're at the negotiating table, because we have not been able to militarily defeat the Taliban. And that failure amounts to a defeat.
As I was preparing my questions for you, I was having some trouble determining where I should even begin. I'm not sure Americans, other than those with friends and relatives directly affected by the war, even think much about Afghanistan anymore, yet here we are 20 years later. What is, in your view, the strategic goal of the United States at this point?
Well, the reason that Americans aren't thinking about Afghanistan is because the all-volunteer force has been abused by our country's leaders and remains out of the spotlight of public opinion to some degree, because unless you enlist in the military, some of those decisions might not immediately affect you. Although I will say that forever wars affects the entire country because they create massive opportunity costs and they hemorrhage the taxpayers' money. And then the other reason that sometimes Afghanistan has been cast aside from the public debate is because Congress has essentially abdicated its responsibility to place checks on the executive branch's war powers. And so the power of the president to continue open-ended conflicts around the world has grown exponentially in the last 20 years. Now, in terms of objectives, I think the primary objective remains counterterrorism. But what we have to ask ourselves is, are we chasing the fantasy that the risk of terrorism can be eliminated completely, or are we managing the risk? And in my mind, managing the risk of terrorism does not require a permanent presence in Afghanistan. Chasing this idea that you can completely eliminate transnational terrorist groups that go from country to country, that requires a permanent presence. And the permanent presence itself becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Al-Qaeda and the Taliban have managed to kill more Americans than they could ever dream of because we were delivering young Americans to the battlefield in Afghanistan for them to kill.
And every time civilians die from U.S. ordnance, those people have relatives who may become radicalized as a result.
Yeah, that's another thing we have to remember, because a lot of proponents of continuing the war in Afghanistan will say, well, look, we have these human rights gains that occurred in Kabul or some of the larger cities in Afghanistan. And that's true. The United States did accomplish a few things. It did improve the rights of Afghans in major urban centers, and that should be recognized. But what was the cost? The cost was there was an incredibly violent counterinsurgency that occurred in rural Afghanistan, where the majority of Afghans live, including Afghan women. So major newspapers liked to publish these feel-good stories about a young Afghan succeeding in Kabul as a result of the US presence there. But more infrequently did they ever address the issue of widows and families that lost their providers and children who lost their limbs and the regular, consistent, everyday violence that occurred in the countryside of Afghanistan throughout the last 20 years of this conflict to essentially form a security bubble around the major cities.
My next question was going to be, what has the U.S. accomplished in Afghanistan over 20 years? We seem to have disrupted al-Qaeda, an organization that had international jihadist aims. But now we're fighting this war against the Taliban, which is a local, so to speak, militia, does not have international aims.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Taliban have always been inward looking. The reason that Mullah Omar wouldn't hand over Osama bin Laden at the onset of the conflict was ideological. The Taliban didn't want to betray al-Qaeda, so to speak. But it wasn't because they endorsed al-Qaeda's vision of jihad around the globe. The Taliban have always been very inward looking, and they continue to be that way. When it comes to al-Qaeda, we did disrupt al-Qaeda. We've killed many of the senior leadership, but al-Qaeda still exists. Senior al-Qaeda members are still being killed in Afghanistan in areas that are controlled by the Taliban. And that is reason for concern. But al-Qaeda has transitioned in some sense to include localized units and localized groups that really have local aims. And their ability to conduct transnational terrorist attacks, I think, is diminished. It exists, but it's largely diminished. And we also have to remember that al-Qaeda is perfectly capable of planning attacks on Western targets outside of Afghanistan. 9/11 was largely planned outside of Afghanistan. The logistics of 9/11 were largely conducted outside of Afghanistan. I mean, it was partly conducted in Florida. So this idea that if we leave Afghanistan, it will become this safe haven for terrorism that threatens the homeland, I think is quite inflated.
If we go back to the start of this conflict, it seems the Bush administration, the U.S. government, at least based on their public statements at the time, got al-Qaeda's motivations wrong right from the beginning. For instance, we were told we were attacked because radical Islamists hate our freedom. But if you listen and read bin Laden's own words, say a 1997 interview he gave to Peter Arnett on CNN, he makes clear his grievances are with U.S. foreign policy, with U.S. military bases, the U.S. military presence in Muslim countries. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the ideological roots of al-Qaeda go back decades and in some sense predate the era of U.S. intervention abroad. I don't think we can blame terrorism entirely on U.S. adventures in the Muslim world, but
agreed.
I do think it's a factor. Support for authoritarian regimes, blatant hypocrisy in our foreign policy at times, drone wars, and protracted conflicts like Afghanistan with counterinsurgencies that in some cases committed pretty grim human rights violations certainly doesn't help. And al-Qaeda and the Taliban are able to use these realities to recruit new members and to justify their cause.
You mentioned the roots of al-Qaeda. They go back to the 1980s, of course, during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The U.S. policy to support the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets actually goes back to the Carter administration. Some years later, Carter's national security advisor, Ziggy Brzezinski, was asked about the wisdom of bringing together thousands of Islamic radicals from all over the world to fight in Afghanistan. And this was his answer. What was more important in the worldview of history, the Taliban or the fall of the Soviet Empire? A few stirred-up Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War? Those words are still relevant, aren't they?
Well, it's short-sighted, and I'm not an expert on Soviet history, but I think the Soviet Union was very capable of imploding itself through its own mismanagement. In terms of Afghanistan, I think the mistake that the United States has made for the last few decades is that U.S. policy does not focus on Afghanistan. U.S. policy views Afghanistan as a hedge against some greater threat. And that threat in the past was the Soviet Union, and now it's this global trend of terrorism, or if you ask others, perhaps it's because of its location between China, Iran, and Pakistan. So depending on who you ask, you get different reasons. But the reasons never take into account the political realities inside Afghanistan and what the consequences of meddling with those balances might be.
A final note about bin Laden, he miscalculated too, of course. He believed the 9/11 attacks would bring about the political disintegration of the United States, and he suffered his own form of blowback as a result. Let's talk about Pakistan now. We can't talk about the U.S. in Afghanistan without getting into the U.S. relationship with Pakistan. You traveled around Pakistan quite a bit for your research. What is Pakistan's role in this current quagmire?
Well, Pakistan is the primary state sponsor of the Taliban, although Pakistan has also been helpful in U.S. counterterrorism efforts, especially against al-Qaeda. So Pakistan plays an inconsistent role. And some of that is due to Pakistan's own duplicity, and some of that is due to Washington's inconsistent message. And we have to remember countries don't mirror our policies. They have their own concerns, and Pakistan certainly has its own concerns about Afghanistan. And that's not to justify their support for the Taliban. But Washington's leaders need to live in reality, and the expectation that Pakistan is going to play ball perfectly with U.S. goals in Afghanistan is a bit delusional. So I think Pakistan in the last 2 years has been helpful in some ways. It helped bring the Taliban to the negotiating table. I don't think it has left everything on the field, so to speak, in terms of what it could do to push the Taliban to reduce violence or participate more meaningfully in negotiations. And I don't think Pakistan's leaders are completely grounded in their expectations about what the US-Pakistan relationship could be with the war in Afghanistan going forward. I think Pakistan's leaders think that they can silo these issues and that we can have a completely dysfunctional conflict in Afghanistan, but that we're still going to be economic partners and counterterrorism partners, and we can build our relationship. And if you look at the messaging coming out of Prime Minister Imran Khan's government, it's very much, hey, let's put Afghanistan behind us and let's focus on economic cooperation, Pakistani exports to the US, a little bit of counterterrorism cooperation. And that's just not going to happen so long as the conflict in Afghanistan remains unresolved. But the United States is also complicit in that dysfunction, because I use the term holding U.S. troops hostage to outcomes in Afghanistan, but we also hold the U.S.-Pakistan relationship hostage to outcomes in Afghanistan. And regardless of what anyone's views of Pakistan are, it is more important to U.S. national interests than Afghanistan. It's a nuclear power. It has a much larger population. It has more economic potential. And in some ways, it even has more terrorism risks. It's more important to have a functioning relationship with Pakistan than necessarily a particular outcome in Afghanistan. And those two things are in conflict with one another.
Also in conflict, the Pakistanis see Afghanistan as providing strategic depth for their conflict with India, whereas we tried to get the Pakistanis to stop supporting the Taliban for our own reasons. And because the goals of the countries can never be squared, it seems like the whole project was lost right from the outset.
Yeah, in fact, it even goes further than that. The Pakistanis see Afghanistan as an arena for strategic depth against India, and they also see it as a potential place for India to destabilize Pakistan. So from the Pakistani perspective, a functioning Afghanistan that is close to India is a bigger threat than an Afghanistan that's in chaos. I don't agree with that assessment objectively, but that's the perception of the Pakistanis. And what makes this conflict so difficult is you have to resolve all of these conflicting regional interests at once. The analogy I sometimes use is it's like a Rubik's Cube, that you're trying to line up all the squares that are the same color, and we're always missing one piece. And that's why we've been there 20 years.
It's hard to believe the future of Afghanistan hinges on whether the United States maintains 2,500 troops in the country indefinitely.
It's an outrageous assertion that the future of Afghanistan hinges on 2,500 troops if you believe that the U.S. is going to keep it at 2,500 troops.
Okay.
I don't think that's what's going to happen. One of the risks of leaving 2,500 troops is that inevitably those numbers will rise. It's like being at a campfire and you keep the fire going a little bit overnight so that you can restart it again. So long as there's 2,500 troops there and there's a risk of casualties inflicted on those troops, and there's a risk of the U.S. being drawn into a counterinsurgency in the rest of the country, the potential to exponentially increase those numbers remains. I'll give an example. Folks in the Biden administration like to say, well, we need to have a small troop presence there for counterterrorism purposes. Okay, fine. Let's take that for granted. They're there primarily to battle al-Qaeda. I find it incredibly difficult to believe that if the Taliban were to launch an offensive against a major Afghan city, say Kandahar city, the US military would just stand idly by and do nothing. The optics of that would be terrible. And that is how the US will be drawn back into this conflict. And that's the risk of remaining there militarily. Nobody is arguing for disengagement from Afghanistan completely, certainly not myself. I do think we should continue providing some aid to the government and its institutions. I do think a stable Afghanistan is better for America's long-term security than a completely unstable one. But I don't think the US should keep 2,500 troops there indefinitely, and I certainly don't think they should add to that number.
So the peace negotiations, there is a May deadline for the United States to withdraw. The peace negotiations did produce a deal last year, but the Afghan government wasn't allowed to participate, right?
The reason for that is that the United States probably wouldn't have been able to get that initial agreement if they had included the Afghan government. One of the demands of the Taliban had always been to negotiate directly with Washington and not through the government in Kabul, which they consider illegitimate. In the perception of the Taliban, they think the Afghan government is just a proxy of the United States anyway, so why not go to the source?
They're not entirely wrong about that, are they?
Yes and no. The government in Kabul could not function without U.S. support. It's reliant on U.S. aid and U.S. security guarantees. But the majority of Afghans do believe in the concept of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. They don't believe in restoring a Taliban emirate. But the U.S. Taliban deal was intended to jumpstart negotiations between the Afghan government and the Taliban using a U.S. withdrawal as the carrot. And now the United States is thinking about removing that carrot and saying, nah, you didn't do enough. So we want you to keep talking with the Afghan government and reduce violence and come to a political settlement, and we'll leave when those things happen. But the Taliban are very unlikely to agree to that kind of extension. But even if they do, and it is possible that they might, it's still unlikely that the Afghan government and the Taliban would achieve a political settlement, because the gap between their vision for Afghanistan is so large.
I was going to ask you, what is the end game here? Is it practical to think there could be a power sharing arrangement between the current Afghan government and the Taliban?
I think it's conceivable that there could be a power sharing agreement between the Afghan government and the Taliban if there was an interim government or a restructuring of the entire system altogether. Some people are calling this proposal Bonn 2.0. That's a reference to the original conference in Bonn. But it's a very tall order. If you look at the way intra-Afghan negotiations have gone to date, they took several months to agree on prisoner releases so that the talks started 6 months later than they were supposed to. And then it took them almost 4 months to even agree to rules and procedures about how to discuss the substantive issues. So if you look at the pace so far, it doesn't bode well for being able to agree to a power sharing arrangement.
How do ordinary Afghans feel about all of this?
In Afghanistan, I still think the average person does not want the Taliban to be back in power, but they prioritize peace over that. And that doesn't refer to the political and civil society elites in Kabul. That group of folks is very much opposed to an increase in Taliban power. But in general, there's some exceptions. But it's difficult to generalize about Afghanistan because there's something like 14 ethnic groups. There's a rural-urban divide. And then there's regional divisions as well.
And that's why many people feel the situation is, in a sense, ungovernable when it comes to having a central government. This society doesn't need to have a central government.
Well, most Afghans I've spoken to, including Afghan intellectuals, argue that there should be a weaker federal government. The Quincy Institute did a Q&A that I conducted with different Afghan stakeholders from Afghan civil society, media, and even folks who were formally involved with government. And across the board, the common thread was we need to have a weaker central government and more power in local government to govern this country for the reasons that we've just talked about. So I think that's definitely true.
The Gordian Complexities of Afghanistan. Adam Weinstein of the Quincy Institute. Thank you for your expertise. Again, the deadline for the U.S. to withdraw its last troops is May 1st. On the next episode of History as It Happens.
It's going to disappear. One day it's like a miracle. It will disappear. And from our shores, it could get worse before it gets better. It could maybe go away. We'll see what happens. Nobody really knows.
1 year ago, the rhythms of daily life abruptly ended as the COVID-19 pandemic began claiming dozens, then hundreds, and soon thousands of American lives, while the stream of misinformation coming from the White House flooded our minds. The Politics of the Pandemic with John Barry, author of The Great Influenza, next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.